Белка, так мы не договорились. Белка!
Cranes Are Flying, in many ways, is the most important post-war Soviet film. Quite simply, you can divide the history of Soviet cinema, certainly as far as it was known in the outside world, into pre-Cranes and post-Cranes. And after the Cranes Are Flying came out, the world got to see it in 1958, there was a whole new attitude to Soviet cinema, which had been more or less a taboo subject since the war and even during the 1930s. I think it's undeniable that Kalatozov's example of his emergence after Stalin's death made possible everything that followed from Soviet cinema, everything that we call the Soviet New Wave. And Cranes Are Flying announced a new spirit in Soviet cinema and a new spirit in the Soviet Union. Mikhail Kalatozov was a young man when he got into film. It's important to remember that Kalatozov was a Georgian. I think that's absolutely fundamental. Originally, his name was Kalatozovishvili, and he dropped the Vili bit, which marked him as Georgian, and became Kalatozov. So he really reached the world of cinema as a Soviet filmmaker in the late 1920s. By all accounts, he had tried a number of other activities and professions. But film was definitely a very attractive proposition in the late 1920s. This is the period when all of the Soviet industries were turning out more films than at any time in their entire history. I think 1927-28 marks the absolute climax. So if you were a young filmmaker, especially in Georgia, keen to break into film, this was your moment. And Kalatozov was very successful. He made a remarkable film that people were talking about for years afterwards. The Salt for Svanetia is a kind of surrealist ethnographic film. It's ostensibly about the people who live in Svanetia, a very remote part of Georgia, who traditionally had a very, very hard life and were short of salt and needed to import it. And it's a film about the poverty, the deprivation, and the strange folk customs of Svanetia. It's about backwardness, and that did not play well in the Soviet Union of the late 1920s. So there was a lot of criticism of the film. People were saying, well, this is not the image we want to present. And so I think that's why the film was kind of put under wraps. But Salt for Svanetia was one of the great secret films of early Soviet cinema. People whispered about it, talked about it. So this was a legendary film, I would say. And so was the film that Kalatozov made after it in the early 30s, A Nail in the Boot. That was apparently the most emphatically banned of all early Soviet films. Nobody thought they would ever see it. When I was young, we used to dream about, what if you could see A Nail in the Boot? We'd read about it, but it had been completely censored, banned in the early 30s as part of the drive towards a new popular cinema. So he had a very interesting start in cinema, and then he seems to disappear from the records of directing films. So there's a long gap. People speculated about this. At one time, there was a rumor that he was in disfavor and was forbidden to film. Actually, he became a bureaucrat. He became somebody who was in charge of aspects of running the Soviet film machine. In the 1930s, Stalin was interested in movies, to put it mildly. Lenin is supposed to have said, for us, cinema is the most important art. Personally, I don't think Lenin ever actually quite said that, but it was taken up as a slogan. Stalin knew that movies were important, not only inside the Soviet Union, but outside. It was the main vehicle for projecting an image of what Soviet life should be. This led to the notorious films of the glory of life on collective farms, where everybody is laughing and singing and they're bringing in the harvest. Tractors are crisscrossing the landscape. It was beyond a joke in many ways. It was a vision of a utopian Soviet Union, which is very far removed from the reality of starvation, famines, the hardship of life on the collective farms and in the new industrial centers. Stalin only wanted to see the good news. Then came the war. During the war, very few new Soviet films ever reached the outside world. The war, of course, meant an alliance between America and the Soviet Union. But it was an uneasy alliance. It was an alliance with many kind of undertones of this won't go on forever. We're only doing it because we have to. It's very interesting that during the actual war period, Mikhail Kalatozov was actually an attaché in America working with the Soviet trade organization, with all kinds of different bodies. His role is a little bit unclear, but one of his jobs definitely was to negotiate to get Hollywood films to show in Russia. He was obviously very capable as an organizer, and he had roles both pre-war and post-war, as far as we know, in the apparatus of the Ministry of Cinema. After the war, there was a marked change of tone in Soviet cinema. It became very dark. In the post-war period, Soviet filmmakers found themselves really in a very, very tight fix. Stalin had entered his final paranoid phase, and he was really off the scale. And he took an obsessive interest in cinema, always had done, but it became more obsessive to the point that the output of Soviet production slowed down to a snail's pace. There simply were not enough films being made to actually feed the cinemas. Filmmakers were scared. They couldn't make films about the reality of the present post-war world because that was a polarized world of the Cold War. They couldn't even safely make historical films unless they were set in the 19th century. And even that history was being rewritten according to Stalin's views about the history of science and so forth. The great watershed, of course, in modern Soviet history is the death of Stalin in 1953. And Khrushchev emerges as the leading figure. And he takes a very bold step. In 1956, at the 20th Party Congress, he delivers what became known as the secret speech. Well, it didn't stay secret for very long. American intelligence sources made sure that it was quickly translated and circulated because it was absolute dynamite. This is a speech in which Khrushchev basically indicted Stalin for the cult of personality and for his domination of the Soviet Union. What has become known as the thaw, then under Khrushchev in the late 50s, there was a real liberalization. And so many things were happening that changed everyday life in the Soviet Union. I mean, there were innumerable differences to people's ordinary lives: housing, food, the freedom to come together, even the encouragement of non-official culture, youth culture, things like that. So it's against that background that Cranes emerges in the 1950s as something completely new, something unexpected, and really it was like a fresh dawn.
Ну вот тебе. Твои журавлики, кораблики.
The big shift that happens, the cranes are flying, which is the shift from the collective, the mass, the aerial view of warfare, as it were, to the personal. The Great Patriotic War, which is what the Second World War is known as in the Soviet Union, of course, was a national tragedy. And what you get in Soviet war cinema, as it were, is an emphasis on the only things that you can be triumphal about. It was the kind of heroic defense to the last drop of Stalingrad and the relentless march of the Red Army westward as it crushes all obstacles. They were very triumphalist. There was little of a personal nature. And interestingly, just before Cranes Are Flying was made, there is a remake of an old film from the 1920s called The 41st, which is about a woman sniper in the Civil War. And that film by Chukrai is a straw in the wind. It's an indication that the filmmakers desperately want to tell more human, more personal stories. But how can they do it? And I think the really important shift is moving away from the battlefront to the home front. It's really a move to ask, what about the people left behind? And that means, what about the women?
Керосинка коптит. Ой, извините. Мечтать, знаешь, после войны будешь.
Strong women who are the protagonists of the film are really almost unknown in Soviet cinema. But somebody who has to really stand up for herself and has to cope, as so many millions of Russian women had to do when the men were away at the war, and who lost their men at the war and had to look forward to a lifetime of spinsterhood, of widowhood. That was never dealt with. The anguish of the home front, the devastated families, the families that had never started. Absolutely taboo subject, as it had been actually in relation to the First World War. Stalin had pretty much mandated that nobody was going to talk about the scale of carnage left behind by the First World War, and essentially the same was true of the Second World War.
Но мы еще на твоей свадьбе гулять будем.
So Cranes is particularly important because it's a film about loss, about heartache, about learning to cope. But in doing that, it's a great step forward from the emotional wasteland that Stalin had left behind in his cinema. The cinematographer, Sergei Gorashevsky, is absolutely crucial to The Cranes Are Flying and to really the great films of Kalatozov. And they obviously work together absolutely hand in glove. Having said that, what Gorashevsky managed to do on Cranes Are Flying and I Am Cuba astonished the world. People had not seen cinematography like this before. And if you look at all the early reviews of the films, there's a kind of open-mouthed wonder. How is it possible? The visual style of Cranes Are Flying is absolutely inscribed in Gorashevsky's immobile use of the camera. And the camera is with the actors in an extraordinarily intimate way.
Нет.
I think the moment that stays in many people's minds is where Veronica is trying to say goodbye to her fiancé, and she's rushing to see him as everybody's heading off to war. First of all, we're very close to her. We're following her in a very rapid, fluid tracking shot. We're sharing her sense of frustration and excitement. And then we realize that this is a scene of mass departure, and the camera floats up high, and we look down and we see a great field of tanks going down the road. She's running between the tanks. It's an extraordinary moment because it's a poetic way of saying that amidst this vast national tragedy, this huge mobilization, what chance does one woman, one relationship have of having a last poignant farewell? There's another aspect to it too, which I think is really important, which is not talked about as much. It's the question of the height of the camera, where it is, what our point of view is, how the camera starts off down low and moves high. And then moves down low again. And that is our point of view on the emotional drama that we're watching. And that really colors the way we understand the dynamic of the relationship between the central characters. The woman who says goodbye to her fiancé, who suffers terribly during the war. One of the striking features of Cranes Are Flying, and it's pretty unexpected coming when it did at the end of the 50s from Soviet cinema, is the expressionistic aspect of it, and particularly the extraordinary scene where Veronica is raped, or an attempt to rape her by Mark, while her fiancé is away at the front, is absolutely electrifying. It out-Hollywoods Hollywood in terms of, the thunder, the lightning, the flashes, and so forth. And in many ways, I suppose you could say that that is following on from what Eisenstein was doing in his last film, which is Ivan the Terrible Part 2. Now, remember, Ivan, although it was shot in the 1940s during the war, was not seen. It was never released until 1956, until Khrushchev decreed that it could be seen. I'm pretty sure that Soviet filmmakers would have seen it during that time. I doubt if it was completely off limits, but certainly the outside world had never seen it. Cranes Are Flying was an extraordinary success on the international stage. And it's probably worth saying that when it won the Grand Prix, as it was then called, the Palme d'Or, in Cannes in 1958, it actually did a lot for Cannes because the Cannes Film Festival had been restarted after the war. And the fact that a Soviet film could win the top prize catapulted the film into a new kind of celebrity, and it also put the festival on the map. It became a launch pad for a kind of triumphal progress around the world. People in the West, in America and across Europe, wanted to believe that the Soviet Union was changing. They wanted to put the dark years of the Stalin era behind them. They pinned a lot of hopes on Khrushchev. They didn't know much about him yet. And I would argue that Cranes sort of stood in for a new vision of what the Soviet Union could be, even though it's a film set during the war. The focus of that film on the personal sent a message that feelings and emotions, human stories, were all right again. We didn't have to just focus on the patriotic. The Cranes Are Flying was in distribution in a way that Soviet films had not been in distribution for a very long time. It was in popular cinemas, it was in art cinemas. And you can draw a straight line, I think, between the impact of Cranes, which really starts from 58, goes right through the end of the 50s into the 60s, and the arrival of the first real new wave film, which is Tarkovsky's Ivan's Childhood, which is 62. These two films really speak to each other. One made the other possible, the other built on the freedoms that Kalatozov had opened up. And that, of course, inaugurates a short but glorious period of new, younger filmmakers, of Tarkovsky's generation, who make use of the freedom that they believe they have and produce this extraordinary effusion of films. So Cranes starts something, but what's interesting, of course, is that Cranes is not a new wave film by a bright new young filmmaker. It's made by a pretty experienced filmmaker who's been round the houses, has lived through the dark era of Stalinism, but is fresh enough and has enough energy and creativity to seize the new freedoms. He sees the film that is needed at that moment.
Моя единственная. Поздравляю с твоим днем рождения.
В этот день ты появилась на свет.
And he makes three other really interesting films. He makes The Letter Never Sent, which is one of the great films set in the Soviet far north. It's a film about exploration in the frozen tundra. Wonderful film. And that kind of goes back to his ethnographic roots in a way. And he makes the first ever Soviet-Cuban co-production, I Am Cuba. And this film is even more daring, even more lyrical, even more extraordinary in its filmic style and in the lyricism that it brings to bear on a subject like the Cuban Revolution. This is not a revolution like we've ever seen it portrayed before. And The Red Tent is also a very interesting film as well. So viewed in the whole, his career has got a certain kind of unity. He ends almost where he began. He's somebody who seized the moment when it was possible to make a new kind of Soviet film and did it with absolute conviction, bringing all his Georgian flair for emotional directness and for unconventional filmic construction. And Soviet cinema and the world, I think, owes them a lot, really, for seizing that moment.
Что стоишь? А? Кому цветы, тому и дари.